The doorbell rang 3 times before David finally heard it. He was standing in the middle of his grandmother's living room, surrounded by boxes and the thick smell of old furniture polish. 3 weeks had passed since the funeral, and he still couldn't believe she was gone. The house felt empty now, like someone had sucked all the warmth out of it. His Aunt Patricia pushed through the door without waiting. She always did that. Even as a kid, David remembered how she'd barge into rooms, announcing herself like she owned the place. She was wearing her usual business suit, the kind that made her look like she was always about to fire someone. "Well, don't just stand there. We have work to do," Patricia said, setting her purse down on the coffee table with a loud thump. "The lawyers want this place cleared out by the end of the month. Your grandmother was organized, thank God, so this shouldn't take too long." David nodded but didn't say anything. He'd taken a week off from his job at the tech company to deal with all this. His boss hadn't been happy about it, but David didn't care. Some things were more important than meeting deadlines and answering emails. They spent the next few hours going through rooms. Patricia had a checklist, because of course she did. She pointed at furniture and rattled off prices she thought they could get at an estate sale. David just followed along, feeling more and more disconnected from the whole process. This was his grandmother's house, the place where he'd spent every summer as a kid. Now his aunt was treating it like a storage unit that needed to be emptied. When they reached the second floor, Patricia paused at a narrow door David had almost forgotten about. The attic. He hadn't been up there in probably 20 years. As kids, his grandmother had always told him and his cousins to stay out of the attic. Too dusty, too dangerous, too many old things that could fall and hurt someone. "We should check up there too," David said, reaching for the door handle. Patricia's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "No need," she said quickly. "I already looked. It's just old junk. Boxes of clothes, broken furniture, that sort of thing. Not worth our time." Something in her voice made David stop. It was too casual, too forced. Like when someone tells you not to worry about something. And that's exactly when you start worrying. "Your grandmother actually mentioned the attic to me," Patricia continued, letting go of his wrist. "Right before she passed. She said there's a blue trunk up there in the corner. Old quilts and moth-eaten blankets. She was embarrassed about it, said it wasn't worth looking at. So let's just skip it and focus on the valuable stuff, okay?" David stared at his aunt. In all the years he'd known her, she'd never once cared about what his grandmother was embarrassed about. Patricia wasn't the sentimental type. She was the practical type. The type who would sell those old quilts at an estate sale if they were worth even $5. After Patricia left that evening, David sat in the living room as the sun went down. The house creaked and settled around him, making the sounds old houses make when they think no one's listening. He kept thinking about the attic, about that blue trunk, about the way his aunt had grabbed his wrist. His grandmother had been different the last time he'd visited, about 6 months before she died. She'd seemed lighter somehow, like she'd made peace with something. They'd been sitting in this exact room, drinking tea, when she'd suddenly looked up at the ceiling and smiled. "You know, David," she'd said, "the most important things are usually the ones people tell you to ignore." He laughed it off at the time, thinking she was just being philosophical in that way old people sometimes got. But now, sitting in the dark, he wondered if she'd been trying to tell him something. David had always been curious. Too curious, his ex-wife used to say. She'd hated how he always had to understand how things worked. Always had to dig deeper into problems instead of just accepting simple answers. That curiosity had cost him his marriage. Or at least that's what she claimed in the divorce papers. Emotionally unavailable and obsessively analytical were the exact words. But his grandmother had loved that about him. When he was 8 years old, he'd taken apart her radio to see how it worked. Instead of getting angry, she'd sat down next to him and helped him put it back together. "Never stop asking questions," she told him. Even when people don't want you to ask them. Around midnight, David made his decision. He grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and headed upstairs. The attic door creaked when he opened it, revealing steep wooden stairs that disappeared into darkness. The air that rushed down smelled like dust and old paper and something else. Something he couldn't quite identify. The single light bulb at the top barely worked, flickering like it might give up any second. The attic was smaller than David remembered, crammed with boxes and old furniture covered in white sheets. In the far corner, exactly where Patricia had said, was a blue trunk with brass corners that had turned green with age. David's hands were shaking as he knelt down in front of it. The lock was broken, hanging loose on one side. He took a deep breath and lifted the lid. No quilts, no moth-eaten blankets. Instead, the trunk was filled with carefully organized papers, folders, and photographs. On top of everything was a white envelope with his name written on it, in his grandmother's handwriting. The ink was shaky, like she'd written it when her hands weren't working quite right anymore. He picked up the envelope and turned it over. It wasn't sealed. Inside was a single piece of paper, and his grandmother's words made his heart beat faster. The letter started with, "Dear David, if you're reading this, you didn't listen to Patricia. Good, you always were the smart one." His grandmother's voice came through so clearly in those words that he could almost hear her saying them. "What's in this trunk is the truth, the real truth, not the story everyone thinks they know. Your grandfather wasn't who people thought he was. Neither was I." David set the letter down and started going through the trunk. There were photographs, dozens of them, showing his grandmother as a young woman. But she wasn't in Portland like she'd always said. The photos showed her in the South somewhere, standing in front of old buildings with groups of people, both black and white together. That was strange because his grandmother had always claimed she'd lived in Portland her whole life. There were letters too, official-looking documents with legal stamps and signatures, court papers, newspaper clippings yellowed with age, and a journal, leather-bound and worn, filled with his grandmother's neat handwriting. As David read through the night, his understanding of everything he thought he knew began to crumble. His grandmother hadn't been a simple housewife who baked cookies and tended her garden. She'd been someone completely different, someone brave and dangerous and absolutely nothing like the quiet old woman he'd known. David didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. The contents of that blue trunk had turned his entire world upside down, and he kept reading and rereading everything, trying to make sense of it all. The photographs showed his grandmother in Alabama during the 1960s. She couldn't have been more than 25 in most of them. Young, beautiful, and standing right in the middle of history. There she was at what looked like a church meeting. There she was talking to people on a street corner. There she was holding papers and looking serious, like whatever she was doing mattered more than anything else in the world. But it was the journal that really got to him. His grandmother had written everything down in careful detail. She described meetings held in secret, messages passed between people who couldn't be seen together in public, plans made in whispers. She wrote about being scared, about watching police cars drive past the house where she was staying, about hiding in basements and attics just like this one. His grandfather wasn't just a hardware store owner. That store had been a front, a place where people could meet without raising suspicion. The back room had been used for planning sessions. The storage area had hidden people who needed to disappear for a while. His quiet, boring grandfather had been running a safe house for civil rights workers. There were legal documents, too. Court testimony from someone listed only as witness S, but the dates match, and the details lined up perfectly with what his grandmother had written in her journal. She testified against landlords and business owners who'd been keeping black families out of certain neighborhoods. Her testimony had helped change laws. It had also made her a target. The newspaper clippings told the rest of the story. Threats had been made. Someone had thrown a brick through the hardware store window. A cross had been burned on a lawn, though the article didn't say which lawn. And then, suddenly, the clippings stopped. There was a gap of about 2 years. And when they picked up again, his grandparents were in Portland, opening a new hardware store like nothing had ever happened. David sat back against the wall, his mind racing. Witness protection. His grandparents had been in witness protection. That's why they moved. That's why his grandmother never talked about her past. That's why there were no photos of her as a young woman in any of the family albums. As the sun came up, David realized he needed to talk to Patricia. She'd known something. That much was obvious. The question was how much and why she tried to keep him away from this trunk. He drove to her house at 8 in the morning, probably too early, but he didn't care. Patricia answered the door in her bathrobe, looking annoyed until she saw the folder of documents in his hand. Then her face went pale. "You went in the trunk," she said. "It wasn't a question. You knew." David replied, "You knew what was in there." Patricia sighed and opened the door wider. "You better come in." They sat in her kitchen, and Patricia made coffee without saying anything. Finally, she set a cup in front of him and sat down. "I've known for 15 years," she said quietly. "Mom told me when I was having problems at work. I found out my boss was doing something illegal, and I didn't know whether to report it or keep quiet. I was scared of losing my job, scared of what might happen to me. So I called Mom, and she told me everything." David just listened, holding his coffee cup but not drinking. "She told me the whole story. About Alabama, about the testimony, about the threats. She told me they'd had to leave everything behind, start over with new names, cut off contact with everyone they knew. She said it was the hardest thing she'd ever done, but it was also the most important. Then she made me promise something." "What?" David asked. "She made me promise never to tell your father. Never tell anyone in the family except you, and only if she died before she could tell you herself." David felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Why not tell Dad?" Patricia looked uncomfortable. "You know your father. You know how he is about politics, about protesters, about people who make trouble. He's become so different over the years. Mom was afraid that if he knew the truth about her, about what she'd done, he'd either fall apart or he'd reject her memory completely. She couldn't stand either option." David thought about his father, about the arguments they'd had over the years, especially recently, about how his father talked about protesters as troublemakers who should just follow the law, about how he'd shake his head at the news and complain about people stirring up problems. That should be left alone. "The memorial service is next month," David said slowly. "Dad wants me to give a speech about Grandma." Patricia nodded. "I know, and that's why your grandmother left this decision to you. She trusted you to decide what to do with the truth. Tell the story everyone believes, or tell the real story. But David, you need to understand what you'd be risking." "What do you mean?" "Your father loved his mother. He talks about her all the time, holds her up as this example of the good old days, of traditional values, of how people should be. If you tell him the truth, you'll destroy that. You'll destroy his memory of her and probably destroy what's left of your relationship with him. Is that really worth it?" David didn't answer. He couldn't, because he honestly didn't know. He spent the rest of the day driving around, not really going anywhere, just thinking. He stopped at a park and watched kids playing. He grabbed lunch at a diner and barely tasted it. He sat in his car in an empty parking lot and stared at nothing. The question kept running through his mind. What would his grandmother want him to do? But that was the problem. She'd already told him what she wanted. She'd left him the trunk. She'd written him that letter. She trusted him to make the choice, which meant she'd trusted him to handle whatever consequences came from it. But there was another question too, one that made him uncomfortable. If he told the truth at the memorial, would he be doing it because it was right? Or would he be doing it to prove a point to his father? To show him that his perfect image of the past was wrong? To win an argument they'd been having for years? David had never gotten along great with his father. They were too different. His father liked simple answers, clear rules, things that stayed the same. David liked questions, complications, things that made you think. His divorce had made things worse. His father had sided with his ex-wife. Said David needed to stop overthinking everything and just be normal. Was he really honoring his grandmother's memory? Or was he using her to score points in a family argument? That night, David went back to his grandmother's house. He sat in the attic with the blue trunk open in front of him and read through her journal again. Looking for answers. One entry caught his attention. His grandmother had written it in 1962, right after she'd agreed to testify in court. "I'm terrified," she'd written. but hiding the truth to protect ourselves, to keep things comfortable. That's just another kind of wrong. The people we love deserve honesty, even when that honesty hurts. Maybe especially then. David closed the journal and looked around the attic. His grandmother had kept these secrets for decades, hidden them in this blue trunk in this dusty corner. But she'd also made sure they wouldn't stay hidden forever. She made sure he would find them. The choice was his now. Tell the comfortable lie or the complicated truth. Keep the peace or risk everything for honesty. David spent the next week diving into research. He couldn't make this decision based only on what was in the trunk. He needed to know if it was all real, if his grandmother's story checked out, or if maybe she'd exaggerated things in her memory. He started with the internet, searching for information about civil rights activities in Alabama during the early 1960s. The more he read, the more everything lined up with what his grandmother had written. The places she mentioned existed. The events she described had actually happened. The dates all matched, but he needed more than that. He needed confirmation from people who study this stuff professionally. So he started making phone calls. The first call was to a history professor at the university downtown. David explained he was researching his family history and had found documents about civil rights activities. The professor sounded interested and asked him to scan and email some of the materials. 2 days later, the professor called back, and his voice was excited. "Where did you find these? These are incredible. The level of detail, the first-hand observations. This is exactly the kind of primary source material we're always looking for. Would you be willing to donate copies to our archives?" The second call was to a lawyer who specialized in historical civil rights cases. David had found the man's name in an article about Alabama housing discrimination. When David mentioned witness S and the case number from his grandmother's documents, the lawyer went quiet for a long moment. "How do you know about witness S?" The lawyer finally asked. "I think she was my grandmother," David said. Another long pause. "Your grandmother was one of the bravest people I never met. Her testimony was crucial to 3 major cases. We've been trying to identify her for years, to give her proper recognition. But the records were sealed. If you're right about this, your grandmother helped change housing laws across multiple states." David felt something tight in his chest. Pride, maybe, or grief, or both mixed together until he couldn't tell them apart. The third call was to a woman who'd written a book about unsung heroes of the civil rights movement. When David described what he'd found, she actually gasped. "I have a chapter about anonymous witnesses," she said. "There was one we could never identify, someone the court records called Songbird. The judge used that code name to protect her identity. I spent 2 years trying to figure out who she was. Can you send me what you have?" David sent her scans of some documents, leaving out anything that identified his grandmother by name. The historian called him back within hours. "It's her," the woman said. "It's definitely her. The details match perfectly. Your grandmother was Songbird. Do you have any idea how important this is? She testified in cases that created legal precedents we still use today. She helped establish that housing discrimination violated federal law. Her testimony was cited in Supreme Court briefs." David sat down heavily in his chair. His quiet grandmother, who'd made him cookies and taught him to play chess, had been part of Supreme Court cases. It didn't seem real. But as he continued researching, David also found uncomfortable truths. His grandmother's testimony had led to arrests. 3 men had gone to prison. One of them had lost his business. Their families had suffered. In her journal, his grandmother had written about this. "I lie awake at night thinking about their children," one entry said. "They did wrong, terrible wrong, but their families didn't. Yet their families are paying the price too. Is that justice? I don't know anymore. I only know that staying silent would have been worse." David found online forums where people argued about historical figures. He saw how quickly heroes got torn down, how complex stories got reduced to simple arguments about right and wrong. He imagined his grandmother's story being picked apart by strangers on the internet, turned into ammunition for political fights she'd never wanted to be part of. He also thought about his father. David called his dad's house once, just to hear his voice, but hung up before anyone answered. What would this do to him? His father had been talking about the memorial service constantly, planning every detail. Determined to honor his mother's memory perfectly, late one night, David was reading through his grandmother's journal again when he found an entry from 1964. After they'd moved to Portland. "Starting over is harder than I thought," she'd written. "No one here knows who we really are. Sometimes I want to tell them, want to shout it from the rooftops. Other times, I'm grateful for the silence. But I wonder what we're teaching our son by hiding. Are we teaching him that courage matters? Or are we teaching him that safety is more important than truth?" David read that entry 3 times. His father had been just a kid when they moved, maybe 5 or 6 years old. He'd grown up never knowing why they left Alabama, never knowing what his parents had done. Had that absence of truth shaped him somehow? Had growing up with secrets made him into the person he'd become? Another entry, from years later. "Daniel asked me today about our past. I gave him the usual vague answers. I watched his little face accept the lie, trust me completely, and I felt like I was failing him. But the alternative, telling a child about death threats and danger, that felt like failing him too. There are no good choices, only choices that hurt in different ways." David closed the journal and rubbed his eyes. He was exhausted. He'd barely slept in days. The memorial service was 2 weeks away, and he still didn't know what he was going to say. He thought about his own life, about his divorce, about how his ex-wife had accused him of overthinking everything. Maybe she'd been right. Maybe this was just who he was, someone who couldn't accept simple answers, who always had to dig deeper even when it hurt. But his grandmother had been like that too. That's what all these documents proved. She dug deep. She'd asked hard questions. She'd made difficult choices that had consequences she'd live with for the rest of her life. David picked up his phone and called Patricia again. Did Grandma ever regret it? He asked when she answered. Did she ever say she wished she'd kept quiet? Patricia was quiet for a moment. Only once, she finally said, right before she died, when she was on a lot of pain medication and not quite herself. She told me she regretted all the secrets, not the actions, not what she'd done, but the hiding afterward. She said the hiding had cost her more than the danger ever did. But David, she was medicated. I don't know if that was really her talking or just the drugs. After hanging up, David went back to the attic. He sat next to the blue trunk, surrounded by his grandmother's secrets, and tried to imagine what she would tell him if she were here right now. The answer came not from imagination, but from the journal. He flipped through pages until he found what he was looking for. An entry from the last year of her life. I've decided to leave everything to David. Not the house or the money, though he'll get those too. I mean the truth. I'm leaving him the burden of deciding what to do with it. It's not fair, I know. But fairness isn't the same as rightness. He's the only one who'll understand why this matters. He's the only one brave enough to handle it. Or maybe I'm just too much of a coward to handle it myself. Either way, the choice will be his. I trust him to make it, whatever it is. I just hope he can forgive me for putting this on him. David closed the journal and sat in the dark attic, crying for the first time since his grandmother died. Not because of grief, though there was plenty of that, but because she'd trusted him, even knowing what it might cost him, even knowing how hard this decision would be. She trusted him with the truth. The question was whether he could trust himself. The memorial service was 10 days away when David finally admitted to himself that he couldn't do this alone. He needed help, but not from family. He needed someone who could look at this situation objectively, without all the emotional baggage that came with being related to everyone involved. He called his old college roommate, Tyler. They hadn't talked much since David's divorce, mainly because Tyler had tried to warn David that he was sabotaging his marriage, and David hadn't wanted to hear it. But Tyler was also the most honest person David knew, sometimes brutally so. I need your opinion on something, David said when Tyler answered. Can we meet? They met at a coffee shop the next day. David brought copies of some of the documents, and Tyler read through them while drinking an enormous iced coffee. When he finished, he sat back and let out a low whistle. Your grandmother was a secret superhero, Tyler said. That's insane. Why aren't you excited about this? David explained the situation, his father's beliefs, the memorial service, the choice between truth and peace. Tyler listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. Okay, real talk. Tyler finally said, "What do you actually want to do?" "I don't know. That's why I'm asking you." "No, that's not true. You know what you want to do. You just don't want to deal with the consequences. So the real question is, what matters more to you? Telling the truth about your grandmother or keeping your father happy?" David started to answer, but Tyler held up his hand. "Wait, don't answer yet. Because there's another question too. Why does your father's opinion matter so much? You guys barely talk anyway. You've been mad at each other for years. So why are you twisting yourself in knots trying to protect his feelings? About something he's wrong about?" "Because he's my father," David said, "and because this will hurt him, so will dying eventually, but that's going to happen anyway." Tyler said, "Look, I'm not trying to be harsh, but you're acting like protecting your father from the truth is somehow noble. What if it's not? What if you're actually doing him a disservice by letting him believe a comfortable lie?" David frowned. "How would that be doing him a disservice?" "Because he's living his whole life based on a false story. He's using your grandmother as proof that his worldview is right, that the old ways were better, that people should just stay quiet and not make trouble. But that's literally the opposite of who she actually was. Every time he uses her memory to justify his beliefs, he's disrespecting what she actually believed in. Isn't that worse than the temporary pain of learning the truth?" David hadn't thought about it that way. He'd been so focused on protecting his father that he hadn't considered whether his father's current beliefs were actually dishonoring his grandmother's real legacy. "But what if he can't handle it?" David asked. "What if it breaks him?" Tyler shrugged. "Then it breaks him. But that's his responsibility, not yours. You're not responsible for managing your father's emotional reactions. You're 34 years old, man. You've got to stop acting like you're responsible for keeping everyone happy." Those words hit David hard because they were exactly what his ex-wife had said. During their last big fight, she'd accused him of obsessing over problems he couldn't solve while ignoring the relationship. Right in front of him, she'd said he'd rather dig into complicated questions than deal with simple human connections. "You're doing it again," Tyler said, watching his face. "You're overthinking. Here's the simple version. Your grandmother left you a choice. Tell the truth or don't. Both options have consequences. Pick one and live with it. Stop trying to find a perfect solution that doesn't exist." After leaving the coffee shop, David drove out to the cemetery where his grandmother was buried. He sat by her headstone, reading the simple inscription, "Rose Patterson, beloved mother and grandmother." No mention of Alabama. No mention of Songbird. No mention of anything she'd actually done that mattered. "I don't know what to do," David said out loud, feeling foolish but doing it anyway. "You left me this choice, but I don't know how to make it. If I tell the truth, I might lose Dad. If I don't tell the truth, I'm basically erasing you. What kind of choice is that?" Obviously, the headstone didn't answer. But sitting there, David remembered something his grandmother used to say when he was a kid and couldn't decide between two options. When you can't decide, ask yourself which choice you'd regret more 20 years from now. 20 years from now, would he regret telling the truth? Maybe. His father might never forgive him. The family might split apart. People might judge his grandmother harshly instead of seeing her as a hero. But 20 years from now, would he regret staying silent? Definitely. He'd regret letting his grandmother's courage be forgotten. He'd regret letting her be remembered as something she wasn't. He'd regret not giving her the recognition she deserved. The choice suddenly seemed clearer. David spent the next week preparing. He reached out to the historian who'd written about Songbird and asked for more information. He compiled a timeline of his grandmother's activities. He organized photos and documents. He even contacted an archive to make sure everything would be preserved properly. But he also wrote two versions of his speech for the memorial. One was the safe version, the expected stories about cookies and gardens and gentle wisdom. The other told the truth, the night before the memorial. David still had both speeches saved on his laptop. He read through them both repeatedly, his finger hovering over the delete button on the safe version, but never quite pressing it. His phone rang. It was his father. "Just wanted to check in," his dad said. "Make sure you're all set for tomorrow. Your mother is worried you're going to be too emotional to speak." "I'll be fine," David said. "Good, because this is important. Mom deserves a proper tribute, something that shows people who she really was. I'm counting on you." There was something in his father's voice, a kind of desperation that David had never heard before. His father needed this memorial to be perfect. He needed his mother's memory to stay intact, to remain this symbol of everything he believed in. David thought about what Tyler had said. Was he protecting his father, or was he enabling him to live in a fantasy? "Dad," David said slowly, "what if you found out Grandma wasn't exactly who you thought she was?" Silence on the other end. "Then, what do you mean?" "Just hypothetically. What if she had secrets? What if her past was more complicated than we knew?" "Everyone has secrets," his father said. "That doesn't change who they were. Mom was a good woman who lived a quiet, decent life. That's what matters. That's what I want people to remember. But what if quiet and decent isn't the whole story?" His father's voice went cold. "David, I don't know what you're getting at, but tomorrow is not the day for your philosophical games. Tomorrow is about honoring your grandmother's memory the way she would have wanted. Can you do that, or do I need to find someone else to speak?" David's hand tightened on the phone. "I'll do it." After hanging up, David opened his laptop and stared at the two speeches. His cursor hovered between them. The safe choice or the true choice? He thought about his grandmother hiding in basements, risking her life for what was right. He thought about her testimony in court, knowing she might lose everything. He thought about her living with secrets for decades because she'd chosen safety over truth. Then he thought about her leaving him that blue trunk, trusting him to make a different choice. David pressed delete on the safe speech. There was only one speech now. He'd tell the truth and deal with whatever happened next. He just hoped he was brave enough to actually go through with it. The morning of the memorial service, David woke up with his stomach in knots. He barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined his father's face when he heard the truth. He imagined the shocked silence in the room. He imagined walking out of that church having lost half his family. But he made his decision. The safe speech was gone. There was no backup plan anymore. The service was being held at a small community center his grandmother had volunteered at for years. David arrived early and found about 50 chairs set up, which seemed like a lot until he realized most of them would probably be filled. His grandmother had known a lot of people, even if none of them had known the real her. Patricia found him standing in the corner, staring at the podium where he'd have to speak. "You okay?" she asked quietly. "I'm going to tell them," David said. "Everything." Patricia closed her eyes for a moment. "Are you sure?" "No, but I'm doing it anyway. Your father is going to be devastated, I know." But Tyler said something that made sense. "By letting Dad use Grandma's memory to support his beliefs, we're letting him disrespect what she actually stood for. That seems worse than the truth hurting for a while." Patricia studied his face. "You sound like her," she finally said. "Like your grandmother. She used to say stuff like that, about how the right choice is usually the hard one." She paused. "I'll support whatever you decide. But you should know, your father is really fragile right now. He hasn't been the same since she died." David nodded, but he'd already made up his mind. People started arriving. Relatives David hadn't seen in years. Neighbors from his grandmother's street. People from her book club and her gardening group. His father arrived with his stepmother, both dressed in black, his father's eyes already red. His father hugged him tightly. "Thank you for doing this," he whispered. "It means everything to me." David felt like he might throw up. The service started with a few prayers and some music his grandmother had liked. Then it was time for people to share memories. Several people got up and told sweet stories about his grandmother. How she brought them soup when they were sick. How she'd helped their kids with homework. How she'd always remembered birthdays. Every story made David's speech feel heavier in his pocket. These people knew a version of his grandmother, but it wasn't the complete version. None of them knew about Songbird. Finally, It was David's turn. He walked to the podium on shaky legs. He looked out at all the faces staring back at him. His father was in the front row, smiling encouragingly. David pulled out his speech. His hands were trembling so much the paper rattled. "I want to tell you about my grandmother," he started. His voice came out stronger than he felt, but not the version of her you think you know. "I want to tell you who she really was." He saw his father's smile falter slightly. David talked about the blue trunk, about the photographs and the letters, about Alabama in the 1960s, about a young woman who'd risked everything for what was right. He showed photos on a screen he'd set up, images of his grandmother looking fierce and determined. Nothing like the gentle old lady they all remembered. He read excerpts from her journal, her own words describing the fear and the courage and the impossible choices. He explained about Songbird, about the court testimony, about how her actions had helped change laws that still mattered today. The room was completely silent. People were crying, but David couldn't tell if they were moved or upset. He kept going anyway, his voice getting stronger as he talked about his grandmother's real legacy. When he finished, he looked at his father. His dad's face had gone through about 10 different emotions during the speech: shock, disbelief, confusion, anger, and now something David couldn't quite read. People came up to David afterward. Some thanked him for the truth. Some told him they wished he kept it simple. Some asked if they could see the documents. But his father didn't say anything. He just left with his stepmother, walking out quickly without looking back. David felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. This was what he'd been afraid of. He'd lost his father. Patricia squeezed his shoulder. "Give him time," she said. That was a lot to process. "I destroyed him," David said. "No, you told him the truth. What he does with it is up to him." The next few days were terrible. David called his father 3 times, but his calls went to voicemail. He sent texts that went unanswered. He'd done exactly what he'd been afraid of. He'd chosen the truth and lost his father in the process. But something else happened too. The historian who'd been researching Songbird contacted him, asking if she could write an article about his grandmother. A local newspaper wanted to do a story. The university archives wanted to display some of the documents. His grandmother's real story was finally getting told, and people cared about it. 2 weeks after the memorial, David got an email from his father. It was long, which was unusual. His father never wrote long emails. "I haven't known what to say," the email started. "I've been angry and confused and hurt. I keep thinking about all the times Mom could have told me the truth but didn't. I feel like I didn't know my own mother. Everything I thought about her, about our family, about our history, was wrong." That's a hard thing to accept. David's heart sank as he read. But then the tone shifted. "But I've been watching videos online. News footage from Alabama back then. I've been reading about what was happening, what people like Mom were fighting against. I've been trying to imagine her as that young woman in your photos, putting herself in danger. It's hard. It doesn't match the person I knew. But maybe that's my failure, not hers. Maybe I only saw what I wanted to see." The email continued. "I'm not ready to talk yet. I'm still processing all this. But I wanted you to know that I don't hate you for telling the truth. I'm trying to understand why she kept it from me. I'm trying to understand why she told you instead. I'm trying to understand a lot of things." It ended with, "You did what she asked you to do. I'm not happy about it, but I think I understand why you did it. Give me some time. I'll call when I'm ready." David read the email 5 times. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it wasn't rejection either. It was something in between, something hopeful. 3 months later, David got a package in the mail. Inside was the blue trunk, the actual trunk, shipped from his father's house. With it was a note. "I went back to Mom's house and got this. I've read everything now, multiple times. I still don't have all the answers about how I feel, but I understand why she left this to you. You were right to tell the truth, even though I didn't want to hear it. This trunk belongs with you. Take care of it. Take care of her story. You're doing what she couldn't do, and I think she'd be proud of that. Love, Dad." David set up the blue trunk in his apartment, not hidden in an attic, but displayed in his living room. He'd started working with a historian to write a full account of his grandmother's life. The book would be called Songbird, The Hidden Story of Rose Patterson. One evening, David was working on the book when he looked out his window and saw a protest march passing by. Young people carrying signs, making noise, refusing to stay quiet. He thought about his grandmother at their age, doing the same thing in a much more dangerous time. He understood now what she'd been trying to teach him. Courage wasn't just about what you did in the moment. It was about what you left behind. It was about making sure the truth survived. Even when the truth was complicated and messy and hard to hear. His phone rang. It was his father. "Hey," his dad said. "I was thinking maybe we could meet for coffee. Talk about Mom, about the book you're writing. I have some stories from when I was a kid that might help. Things that make more sense now." David smiled. "Yeah, Dad, I'd like that." As they talked, David looked at the blue trunk sitting in his living room. His grandmother had given him a burden, but she'd also given him a gift. The gift of her real story. The gift of truth. The gift of understanding that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to let the people you love be forgotten or misunderstood. The trunk would stay visible. The story would be told. And maybe, slowly, his father would come to know his mother the way David had learned to know her. Not as the perfect symbol of a simpler time, but as the complicated, brave, real person she'd actually been. That seemed like the kind of memorial his grandmother would have actually wanted.